Thank you so much, Debbie and Julia, and to the whole Catalyst community for having us here. Lovely to see everyone again. For those of you joining for the first time, Jacob, welcome. Great to have you here. Hopefully you'll be able to catch up, and you said you've been doing some reading on the side, so hopefully it'll be part of this. Wonderful. We really feel that we're just scratching the surface, and these three sessions have could have been 3 weeks worth, so thanks for joining us again today. I'm actually not going to do a check-in because Debbie, I think you've done a good one for us, and I know that we run out of time a little bit, and so let's rather save that time for some of the discussion. If you'll recall from the first 2 sessions, we really tried to set up kind of a bit of the history of why we're in the space we're in the social change field, and why we all feel a little bit stuck, and why we're all part of this grand Catalyst community to think more about systemic change. And we set the framework for the book that described the principles and the practices of systems work. Our strong belief was we need to start talking about the way that we work and how we do the work if we really want to see the changes, and we've kind of been through that. And hopefully shared some practices and some case studies that really served as where the practices came from, as a learning mode for all of us. And so what we've really heard over the last couple of weeks, some from you in this course, but also from other people who are reading it, is really an affirmation, and we heard that last week as well, of practices you're already doing, and giving some words and some label and some hooks to those that allow you to take forward those conversations with your partners, with your teams, etc. And so that's really been affirming for us. As I described last week, at one point we were going to call this book the hidden work, and it's really been affirming to just hear the stories and hear with all of you in breakouts, and to see that so many of these practices are happening, but may not be always well described or well understood or well related in the kind of conversations you have with others about kind of what really matters in your work, and why intuitively some of this work is what you do, even if it is not always formalized. So what we really wanted to talk about today, and so that focus has really been around the organizations you run as the primary kind of focus, but obviously we've been speaking a lot about primary actors in that as well. I think what we wanted to speak about today was the role of supporting actors, and how the practices they have are part of systems work and not somehow separate to it, but actually there are different sets of practices that can echo or support the kinds of practices we spoke about in the last couple of weeks. So that's what we'll run through today, and we will also then make sure that we have, as always, some time for your own independent work, because I do think it's always, all of us are on this hamster treadmill, and forcing some reflection time for your own work is hopefully some space we can provide you, even just for a few minutes, and then some discussion as we normally have in breakout groups. What we do want at the end, given this will be the last of the 3 sessions, is for you perhaps to also share amongst the group, what has been some kind of key insights and takeaways. So that's the agenda for today. Cynthia, maybe over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Francois. And thank you, everyone. It was so great to check in with a personal question. It really felt like just getting to know all of you over these last 3 weeks has been a great opportunity. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a recap just to make sure we're all caught up. And then we will dive into this topic of rallying our supporting actors. A lot of the discussions that we've had are around who are our primary actors, who are those who reside at the point of greatest complexity, who are those who have the best ability to build responsive and representative systems that can adapt with change. So the systems work principles that we talked about in session 1, the first of those was fostering connection. The second of those was embracing context. And the third of those was the reconfiguration of power. And by fostering connection, we were attempting to see in what ways can we keep groups of primary actors together so that they can stay together while learning and adapting. In embracing context, it's building the capacity of those primary actors in order to adapt and make decisions at the front lines. And then in the reconfiguration of power, this is really addressing those issues of depth and how do we ensure that those positions of decision-making and positions of agency are kept for the long term in policies and patterns of behavior. And then moving on to the practices that support those systems work principles. So if the systems work principles are the values, what are the activities on a day-to-day basis that support those values, that ensure that primary actors are always at the heart of the process? We talked about cultivating collectives, equipping problem solvers, promoting platforms, and disrupting policies and patterns. And for each of those, we did a quick dip into some case studies that show how that can happen in real life. And those case studies are supported by even more case studies in the book. So even just the quick survey that we did last week, there's more material in the book to also support your work in these practices. So today, what we're going to be talking about is the supporting actors. So who are supporting actors? We are often acting in a supporting actor role. So those who are supporting the primary actors who are really in the position of decision-making and in the position of activity. But oftentimes we talk about supporting actors, and those are the people who are working alongside primary actors and often funding the organizations that support primary actors. So today we're going to be talking about two really key roles that supporting actors play. The first is around measuring systems work or creating the conditions for measurement. We'll talk about how that measurement is actually best when it's placed in the hands of primary actors to support decision-making. And then also funding of systems work. And again, in this particular area, funding can be a partnership. And in fact, it also can be put in the hands of primary actors. So in all cases, the supporting actors are working to support primary actors in their activities. So let's talk about first the measuring of systems work. And François, would you like to walk us through these four tactics?
Thank you, Cynthia. Indeed. I think just to kind of preempt I think the discussion probably many of us have had around measurement of social change work at some point in our journey, right? And at some point you come across that conversation. Either it's a question you ask yourself, okay, well, what are we achieving and how are we achieving it? Or it's being asked of us by others. What have you achieved, or we'll give you money if you say you will achieve this. And I think, those are we've all been in those situations and recognize, they are in some ways, broken, if I can put it that way. In some ways, we feel the dance that we do, and we feel the power relations in that, and we recognize that it is often, it's connected to and it's an expression of this industry of social change. And while I think the strong movement towards better measurement, performance management has really forced a conversation around what works. We have also been worried and sought to explore in what ways that perhaps perpetuated some of the dynamics that we, I think, have surfaced and tried to think about, and some of the ways in which systems are structured. So I think what we sought out to do was look at those that were doing this deeper systemic work that we were looking at in our case studies. How were they thinking about kind of the progress they were making, given a lot of this work and the practices we've described are quite highly relational, and also were in support of primary actors. And so again, these are not entirely new and builds on decades of work, but I guess what we wanted to emphasize were practices that we felt were supportive of more systemic work. And so when thinking about the who, okay, well, who's doing the evaluation, moving from the objective setting academic researcher that will come in and be totally, in a lab coat, in an extreme environment, observing what's going on and being objective about what's really happening, versus supporting practices of self-evaluation. And I think we'll talk about this, and we'll unpack each of them. When we talk about the what, again, we in the world that we currently live in, I think we are so often focused on what we can measure and what is tangible versus, surfacing perhaps what is less tangible, but perhaps as important, sometimes more important. And what are the good practices and what are the ways of thinking about making the invisible value understood. Then how do we do that? Clearly, the extreme of the environment is we run projects and then, at the end of it, we'll decide to come in and try to evaluate what happened versus thinking much more about learning and evaluation as not only a cycle and therefore cycles of feedback loops and shortening those feedback loops as much as possible, but also as part of the process itself, as opposed to something separate from it. And ultimately, why do we do this in the first place, right? Why are we really measuring? What are the real reasons we do measure it? And trying to surface a little bit around we're actually measuring for meaning, and we'll start to explain a little bit of what we mean by that. Good, I'll leave it there because we're going to unpack each of them. I think I'm going to go first on the first practice, so supporting self-evaluation. So I think this might be maybe familiar to many of you. I mean, I think there are lots of practices from lots of organizations that have increasingly been doing that. There are examples from the days of microfinance, and where primary actors are really positioned not only as sources of data, but actually designers, collectors, and evaluators of data themselves. And so, if you remember, we spoke about primary actors being those that are closest positioned to the issues that we are working on. And so those could be both, your staff and organizations, but also citizens and communities that we work with. So this again builds on things like developmental evaluation and asset-based community development, and many important efforts that have been to drive self-driven evaluation of programs. And so, I think we've seen this, and there are many measures that we've seen that don't necessarily work well when other people are setting the standards, when other people are doing the measuring. And I think this is a strong drive, and we saw certainly with the People's Report of Catalyst, a first attempt to build that philosophy into thinking about the SDGs, for example. So I think SDGs are a great example of that. So the one we talk about in the book, and that's obviously one of several, is the poverty stoplight movement that actually has different versions of it around the world. In South Africa, they've built something called the Green Light Movement that is based on some of this. What's interesting and important about the poverty stoplight is it provides an opportunity for people to self-determine and self-evaluate based on a number of measures across, and using tools that can work across different levels of literacy and different environments for people to self-determine, what degree of opportunity they have, what degree of income they have, and kind of what state they find their lives and their families are in. And this has been really, it's taken up a lot of interest, and I think has been extremely powerful. Obviously, this builds on a lot of anthropological approaches as well. But what it has helped to do was to empower and provide also a process really for ongoing measurement and feedback by putting us in the hands of the individuals. And so, poverty is one of the most extreme examples where, we have the World Bank setting what a poverty line is based on some economic figure of the year. And that determines whether someone is in poverty or not. And there obviously is a great degree of disempowerment with approaches like that. And so I think this movement has started. There are other, many other examples of doing this. This is one that we looked at more closely. And yeah, maybe I'll leave it there. I don't know if people want to jump in and have other examples of self-evaluation that they'd like to share for a moment. Cynthia, do we have time for people to jump in as well? Good, because otherwise I find I'm just going to talk the whole time, and there's so much richness in the room.
Can I?
Farhana.
Oh yes. Hi. Good morning. Good afternoon. Wherever you all are. It's afternoon here in South Africa. I think I just wanted to add on to the poverty stoplight, and I could resonate with what you were sharing about the power of the self-evaluation tool as I use it in practice and in some of the organizations that I work with. And what I picked up is just really the importance of, if we look at the practices of systems work, sorry, I'm just getting to terms of all the terms, is just really the importance of equipping the problem solvers, the timing of when the self-evaluation is done, and also the trust relationship. Because what I've seen is often when the evaluations are done without that understanding, there's actually some organizations that if it's done too early when the assessment is done, it has an impact on the results of how the primary actors actually respond to the assessment. So it's just a lot of factors that need to be taken into consideration as well. But other than that, it's just really powerful. So that's just a comment that I wanted to make.
Thanks so much for her.
Okay.
Does anyone have other examples of self-evaluation?
François, I think Cameron has raised his hand.
Apologies.
At the other end, there's self-evaluation of the large corporate funds. Apparently, according to Jin, 500 billion has been allocated to impact investment. So at that end, how do we approach evaluation?
That's a really important point. I mean, I think we're talking here clearly about primary actors, and I think that's the key point, is that in the past, no one's really, involved citizens in, particularly on the issues we're working with. I think what you're speaking about, maybe it's the same term, is for me obviously highly problematic if those who are investing and using their capital also, self-evaluate their own progress. I mean, that's like anything where one doesn't have necessarily third-party evaluations to actually verify that. I think this case is somewhat different because I don't think we've ever asked or sought for the deep participation of people. And I think it's about, this is part of the same process of providing agency that the other practices also provide. And I think that's why we're looking at measurement not only as, an important area for us to look at as supporting actors, but actually as practices of this kind of work itself, because the process itself for us is reinforcing some of the other practices around providing agency to people to be, determining, design and solutions, and how important the role then of evaluation is in that. Was that a clear enough distinction? I think it's an important point, but I might not get into a critique of impact investing right now, otherwise we could take some more time.
And so should we go ahead into the next practice? Yeah, and then
we'll keep the rhythm.
We'll keep the discussion going after each practice as well, and they do feed on one another. They do support each other. So if each of the practices bring up things from the previous, please add. So this second practice was around surfacing of invisible value, and like François said, kind of a result or an outcome of the industry of social change is that we often believe that we can't manage what we can't measure. I think that's a quote attributed to Peter Drucker. And this idea that we can't manage what we can't measure oftentimes leads us to not even try to look at those things which are invisible or which are not measurable, which are unmeasurable. We looked at an organization called Revaluation, which is trying to actually look at the invisible value. And they'd make a distinction between the visible, or that which is evidenced today. So what are the things that we actually can measure today in terms of change? But also those things which are invisible, and they define that as that which may be revealed over time. we often know that the change that we're trying to seek, or many of the changes that we are seeking, are only evidenced in decades or generations. And so the ability to then measure those things is close to impossible. But are there indicators that can show us that we are on the right track? And the case study that we looked at here is child and youth finance. And one of the things that we looked at closely was the dashboard that CYFI was using in the last year of their existence, of their initiative. And what we really enjoyed about looking at this one was that CYFI actually put indicators into their measurement activities that didn't show that those things were happening maybe right now, but they were milestones that showed that those things were coming down the path. Things like policy adoption, groups forming, things that were happening in terms of policy development. So negotiations that were happening, conversations that were happening, things that indicated that the change that was being sought were coming in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And based on those types of measurements, they were able to see that there were invisible things happening beneath the surface that were going to contribute to the long-term change. I think for every organization, that's going to look a little bit different. CYFI spent quite a long time developing that dashboard so that they could then dig through the communications and the interactions that they had had over the course of about 5 to 7 years to see what had materialized in that time. But I thought we thought it was a really good example of an organization that was attempting to really put measurement against invisible value. Invisible value can be those connections, relationships that are happening that we don't necessarily track in our output measurements or in our outcome measurements, but which we know have a substantial impact on whether change can materialize. So trying to put some milestone activities towards that, milestone measurements to that, can help us reveal that over time. Does anyone else have examples, maybe practices in your own organizations or things that you have seen that could surface that invisible value over time?
I can discuss an issue which happens most frequently in meetings when people who take over the airspace and talk a lot preempt those who are thinkers but do not speak. And so in community meetings, those who don't speak and don't have, for whatever, and there are many reasons why people don't speak, are therefore precluded from participating. And in our program, we use a talking piece, which means that everybody in the circle has a chance to participate when the talking piece reaches them. And that also means that they have the opportunity to think, and there may be silence in that group for a while until they speak. Well, the measurement of the impact of this possibility that silence and inability to participate in the dialogue that happens in communities, because everything is always quick paced, and those who are most emotional and are most intent on speaking are the ones who are heard. The measurement of the importance of silence and the importance of giving voice in a particular way to make sure it happens has been a challenge.
I love that, Eva. I think that's a really great point, that sometimes we've privileged certain types of communications and certain types of ways of communicating, and opening up space for other ways is extremely important. Thanks for sharing. Colin, I see that you raised your hand.
Yeah, thanks. I really love that, Eva. You've said it very poetically, but dead on. And yeah, I'm in an organization and we kind of generate about 1.5 million lines of data a day. But what I've found over time is that hurts us as much as helps us, because of the way it is used, the way it's, decoded, distorted, or just totally invalidates anything that can't be captured with the same precision and timeliness. And I say invalidates, it's that because over time, there is a kind of global north, I would say illness is that if it's not captured by data, it didn't happen. And anybody of my age, pre-data in marketing, know it's all about how you decode data. It's all about knowing what you can't capture, and a little bit like what you're intimating here. So I find that incredibly powerfully distorting when you think you know what you're doing because you've picked an arbitrary half a dozen KPIs. It's what you're not capturing, and in marketing terms, unexpressed need as well. People also don't tell you what they want and what they need. So yeah, I think it's very, very interesting how you value that and how you can value both, and actually how an intelligent, if you buyer of that value, would decode both pots of data-rich measures against data-poor measures. I think that's a fascinating area.
Thanks, Colin. I think that's a really great point. And it brings up this issue of complexity. How much can we actually understand, and what are the stories that we tell with the data we do have, and what's in between those data points that we don't understand? Holding those two at the same time, that which we understand and that which we don't, is really key. I'm going to go with Francesca next.
Thank you, Cynthia. Hello, everyone. I'm working with Tostan that works in West Africa, mostly at with communities and empowering community-led development. I thought a lot about this surfacing of invisible value, and I would suggest that it's not just about value that's realized over time, and it is very much about the quality of relationships and experiences. And let me give you a concrete example to illustrate. We don't focus on any one sectoral area, but because it's a holistic program, it also includes health and reproductive health. And we see greater use of prenatal care and greater uptake of prevention of pregnancy. But what we see that's really important, and it's the invisible value, is that before that happens, there is greater voice and influence of the women and greater discussion between husband and wife regarding family planning, for example. And so that's the invisible value. It's that conversation that happens. It's the fact that women are able to express, it's the fact that women are able to influence. And nobody's measured, or very few people are measuring that specifically. They go directly to the reproductive health outcomes. So the greater focus on the relationship tells you a lot, or tells us a lot, us all. Thank you.
I love that, Francesca. Thank you for sharing. I think you're right. That which is revealed over time, but also that which is revealed right now, in terms of quality of relationships. Wonderful, thanks. I'm going to go, let's do Valeria and Sarah, and then we'll move on to the next practice.
Hi, I work in the field of tourism transformation, and what we really want to do, what we are advocating for, is for the sector to use new KPIs, because the current KPIs are completely outdated. They're completely growth focused, and there is no look at any impact, sustainability. And as I always have in my mouth, we need to use impact-driven KPIs, and some people are like, so okay, what is it? And, especially journalists are like, okay, so what are the right kind of indicators? And I realized that what I found myself saying more and more is that, well, there's no really universal indicators, because it changes for each place, right? The different places have their own context. You rightly say in the book, their right challenges and so on. And we often speak about the fact that currently government is incapable of measuring data, or start measuring data. For example, I'm based in finance that is struggling so much. with tourism. They're just starting this big data room. But I was like, what's the point? They've taken so many years creating that room, while it's been 30 years that the community can tell you exactly what are the problems here. And we've been waiting all that time to create this and then start looking at doing something maybe one day. So I was saying, I think that often we need to look at the community, at the knowledge that is locally, and use this, I don't know how to say that, the knowledge of the community as a data. We need to consider as a validating point to start building on. We don't need to have the latest technology to be able to consider that we have valid information that we can leverage to work. And I also at the conference, another question for governments, like, yeah, how do we use data? Is data important? And I do believe though that data should be at the core of everything. That's really important. But whatever data we might have, there should be the story of the community, of the people reflected with that data. We can't use data in isolation, right? There should be the people saying, what does data actually mean? Because otherwise just interpretation. So yeah, so that just was just a bit of perspective, you know, with this question of data. I hope it's useful to some of you.
Very useful. And thank you for pointing that out. You know, we talk often about data as acting separately from those who deliver the data or from whom they are collected from, but the significance of that data can be interpreted by those who are actually the collectors of data as well. So they don't have to sit in isolation. These practices can build on one another. I think that's a really great point. Okay, Sarah, can you round us out here?
Yeah, I'll try to be quite brief. I really appreciated all the other comments. We work in last mile communities with energy access, and we are very proud that we have used a lot of intake and follow-up surveys and data to inform programming and also to feed back to the communities. But until we really built in some listening opportunities with our grassroots partners who are implementing all the programming, and allowed for many of the women who are taking part in a maternal project, so they receive a solar light with which to take care of their children. And until we really built in some space for them to tell us what some of the impacts were, some of those invisible impacts, we had no idea that it was impacting, for instance, empowerment, that they were being able to make decisions about what they could eat and cook, what they were making decisions about the savings and how they could buy a pig that was then their own, and it was this shifting of the relationship within the family that was fascinating, and we wouldn't have gotten it just from our the questions that we had developed to try to measure the impact. And one other thing that we are hoping to look at moving forward is several women were talking about how it was reducing the domestic violence, because when they got up to nurse their baby in the middle of the night, they weren't using the very precious kerosene. They had their own light that they owned, and they had the agency. So anyway, it was those hidden moments, and I really appreciate all the other contributions here.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Sarah. These are great stories. Wonderful examples. Thank you. Okay, François, you want to take us through?
Yeah, I'm just going to dive right in. And I think this one is interesting because I think everyone's faced it. The timelines that are set around measurement, I think we've all been part of, and who determines those timelines is often by other stakeholders or the donors or whoever's been part of the conversation on why something needs to be measured, and often that is quite arbitrary and usually very short term versus some of these longer term timeframes where change happens. So I think what we've seen is a lot of the organizations that we looked at were starting to push back around why should those timelines be the way they are. And also at the same time, thinking about more frequent ongoing data collection that actually guides the learning and the decision making, as well as being able to meet whatever reporting requirements might be there, but not oh, we've got a report to do, so let's go and do an evaluation because that report. So I think we've seen that and how in this, one of the organizations that we spoke about, Family Independence Initiative, which we shared last week, has a platform called Up Together, which is actually now the name of the organization as well, that allows families to not only see their own data, but also pool data from their community that helps them actually then make decision making. So they're getting not only are they participating by using the platform in terms of self-evaluation, but they're also getting the results of that and then being able to make decisions on it in some ways in real time. We also saw that with Beertzog and the nurses that they're actually able to manage some of the real-time insights. And so it's actually thinking about how, what is really the time frame. I think this was answering the question around when. And I think what we try to do in the measurement is ask us some core questions around why is it set up the way it is, and how is it helping us, and how is it sometimes perpetuating systems of power, and particularly interested for us is what are the practices that actually then support the systems work in the way that we are trying to describe it here. And so I do think the ability for the primary actors to have access on an ongoing basis to data, to the feedback, to what the organization is doing together with them is really empowering and allows them to actually then have decision making. We talk about, well, the ability to make decisions. You can only make decisions based on good data. So how do we make sure that data is in the hands of those who really need it, but also really the kind of one of the things we saw again and again was how these were shorter and shorter feedback loops. And obviously that can be empowered by technology. I don't want to go on too long on that one, Cynthia, because I think that's probably relatively straightforward and we may need to catch up a bit of time.
Yeah.
So unless maybe if there are specific comments on that.
Let's go to the next one and then we can
move on.
consolidate the comments.
They all kind of bring them all together.
Yeah, and I just want to add here, a lot of one of the systems work practices or tactics around sustaining motivation. Data can be highly motivating, particularly when it's coming in real time. So this ability to be able to see data, make decisions, and then see the progress, a really powerful tool. So our last one, and this is more the philosophical question, why are we measuring? A lot of what we observed was organizations really taking measurement into their own hands rather than being a reaction to a funder request or an external request, rather driving that process from the inside and really making sure that the measurement process was supportive of the primary actors in their activities. And not seeing it as a reporting tool. There's a wonderful quote in the book from Revaluation. They said, if we're just measuring outputs against a predefined set of outcomes, then we're just accountants. We don't want to be accountants. So oftentimes funders and external actors are asking us to account for the money, account for the activities, but rather the meaning behind this is that we're looking to stay committed or close to our commitments and our values to ensure that on a day-to-day basis, on a month-to-month basis, the activities that are being carried out are allowing us to achieve the longer-term change that we foresee. And oftentimes there are shifts and modifications that come as a result of that measurement and allowing that learning and that adaptation as an essential part of the process rather than trying to just basically create a tick box exercise. So I'm going to ask François to jump in here too, because he spent a little bit more time with the Revaluation team. But essentially this was Revaluation's pilot project of trying to really look at an initiative and try and do a much bigger picture look at how they were measuring change. The NHS, National Health Service in the UK, has an initiative called Change Day, where hundreds of thousands of employees across the country are able to drive their own initiatives for change and innovation. But really, they saw that there was a lot of energy poured into this initiative, but the ability to actually ensure that it was achieving the objectives that they were trying to achieve was difficult. François, do you want to add in a little bit about how they were able to make this process work?
Yeah, I think the first thing that's interesting about the two Andrews who run and started reevaluation is that they were not, specifically monitoring and evaluation specialists, which I think is probably, where some change comes from. And so I think the one Andrew Darnton was a advertising professional who was also working on behavior change and started becoming a researcher in behavior change. And Andrew Harrison was actually from the climate change movement and was a facilitator working with learning systems. And so they were actually tasked to kind of think about, well, like, how does this NHS Change Day actually impact the NHS? Is it just the individual projects that come out of it, or what else was actually being created? And I think that's, was this big effort. I don't know if any of you know it. Essentially, it's almost like a big innovation challenge to anyone in the NHS, this massive public health systems, to say, how can you make things better in the NHS? And so, initially, if you're just looking at the tangible value of what came out of it, you could perhaps as an administrator say, well, that was good, but did it really change? Did those projects actually change specific outcomes? How do we measure each one? And was it worth the investment and time off and whatever else? But when they started digging deeper into that, there was this much deeper question around, well, what does the kind of NHS mean to people, and how do people feel about their ability to have that? It's, in a way, it's our NHS, and that kind of the ability to have an ownership of it. So this was kind of both surfacing the invisible value and how they went about trying to capture that. And the process of doing that was also surfacing the meaning of what this meant to people. So, I think that became this kind of large project, also became a really instructive for them to start thinking about not only the ability to kind of surface kind of the invisible value, but also think about how that was important for the sustaining of the NHS. And I'm wondering also now, it'd be interesting to go back to them, given what the NHS has been through, like many health systems, to say, what did this contribute to that? And they talk about it, and you can read about it in the book a little bit, around how this work helps to capacitate, calibrate, or calculate. So, it's going from more quantitative measures of both tangible and intangible, visible and invisible value, through to more what capacity is this actually building in the system, rather than just thinking about, okay, what are the outputs of the specific projects that we created through this challenge. And so I think that was really interesting for them, and I think was really eye-opening to the NHS to be thinking much more around what does that represent as an initiative, rather than just project outcomes.
I'm just checking time here. We probably should move along. Is there what should we go ahead and just wrap this one up, François, and move on to the funding? Why don't we?
Yeah, let's do that.
Because we can have a lot of these conversations in our small groups too, and we don't want to compress those. I do want to pick up really quickly on a point that Cameron is making in the chat box about, is measurement as a term, does it presuppose quantification? And the reason why I want to pick up on that is because I do think there's an interesting point here. We actually really struggled with this term measurement. What is the term that we're going to use for this? And one of the things that we realized was that measurement can actually both be quantitative and qualitative. A lot of the terminology that we use around MEL can presuppose quantitative measurements, but in fact, measure as a term can also be used to kind of take the temperature, to take the tone of what's happening. So I think there's kind of a twist on lingo here that we tried to use, but it's difficult. We really do get stuck in terminology often.
Yeah, I think the way we try to describe it is the primary aim was to think about, or try to determine what is happening rather than what worked, right? And I think that's the way we kind of try to, if you have that as your mindset, I think then it becomes part of the work itself, rather than something that one might reflect back on. And, I think qualitative methods are part and parcel of certainly the measurement and evaluation world. But I think we're in also a world where social entrepreneurs certainly feel the pressure to think about, well, the only way we can really prove ourselves is if we do a randomized control trial. I come from the world of randomized control trials. There's a lot of power in them, and they are important. But if that's our only way to determine whether, you know, we're on a path towards more transformative, deeper change, then, you know, we're in trouble.
Okay, so let's jump into funding here. I know this is a topic that we could spend, again, a week on, and it feels like each of these we could really foster so much conversation and learning from this group. But we will dive in. Here, in terms of looking at funding, we really tried to look at the practices for funding that were supportive, but also that backed up from just a kind of transactional relationship between funder and grantee. So we really started to think about, what does it mean when a funder sees themselves as a supporting actor and sees themselves as a partner in the long-term change effort. So we observed 3 different roles that funders were playing in this arena. The first of those was, we called it seeding. So this is where funders are actually taking a strong position to create the conditions for learning, oftentimes amongst a group of primary actors or of organizations that are supporting primary actors. The second of these is nurturing, and here it's where both the funder and the grantee or the recipient of funding are really trying to grow a trust-based relationship beyond that transactional relationship. So as François kind of led into this with, you know, all of these practices are relational. They move beyond the industry of social change where we're just transacting to achieve social change, but rather we see ourselves in relationship for achieving change. And the third of these is around propagating. And this is where funders actually kind of use their role as a connector to connect groups to large scale and oftentimes very long-term funding. So trying to connect the dots over a number of different organizations and a number of timeframes to achieve large-scale change. So we'll dive into each of these, and then what we'll do is we will go through these in a more quick way, but then we'll get into our groups so that we can really have these conversations in a more deeper way. So seeding systems work. This was one of the areas that we really had a lot of interesting case studies and practices that we were looking at. Here we saw that certain more radical style, I would say, organizations, funding organizations, were really trying to see their role as creating intentional ways for people to work and learn together. And the organization that we looked most closely at was Lankley Chase in the UK. And we looked at a project that they had called the Elephants Project. They called this because they saw themselves as trying to bring or to reveal the elephant in the room. And the place where this initiative was seeded was in Greater Manchester, and this was bringing together those who were primary actors and those who were the kind of agents of power in that. So oftentimes, I mean, this could even result in the mayor sitting down with a person who was living in homelessness, putting together someone who was in a position of municipal power with someone who was living the severe disadvantage that they were trying to reverse. This project has actually kind of spun out into a bigger initiative. And in fact, now the Greater Manchester Initiative for Lankley is one of their biggest flagship projects. And it's bringing together organizations that can really have a big shift in Greater Manchester, but oftentimes really trying to look very closely at those power dynamics and put people in positions of positional power in relationship with those who have severe disadvantage, and trying to ensure that that conversation can happen in really productive ways. What was interesting to us about Lankley is that they said that in fact it was the prep work to get to those conversations which took the majority of their efforts. That oftentimes just getting to that conversation required an enormous amount of effort that required their support and funding. François, do you want to do nurturing?
So much, Cynthia. Yeah. So I think we saw this as, you know, the different kinds of practices funders were doing at different stages in the actors they worked with. So what we described as nurturing was bringing some trusted partner organizations together and moving the decision-making and shifting the decision-making process to the primary actors in the system, and lessening some of the restrictions and changing some of the timeframes for partners to receive support. So I think the example here was this kind of shifting of decision-making. A really interesting one is the Red Umbrella Fund, and actually some of you may or may not know that kind of Catalyst is thinking about, well, if there was a design of a fund that was actually owned by social entrepreneurs and driven by social entrepreneurs, what would it look like? And I kind of suggested, well, there are some models of this out there in the world, and the Red Umbrella Fund is one of them. So this fund is owned by and promoted by and run by sex worker organizations represented by sex workers themselves. And so they were created to strengthen kind of the sex worker rights movement and catalyzing new kinds of funding. But the way they actually worked on this was creating a fund where what typically are grantees are actually actively participating and leading the governance and the administrative mechanisms around who should be funded, applications, decision-making processes. And so there's actually leadership of sex workers in the grant-making process. And so this whole fund was really set up to be run, for and by sex workers around the issues around sex work. So everything from advocacy to legal support, to social support, to policy work, etc. So I mean, it was just really interesting as a quite a unique sense of the donors who were there to actually support and seed this, actually allowing this to grow and be formed by the grantees, and really, giving up quite a lot of the power and say around, how this should be run, who should be selected, who should be supported, and really handing that over to a set of organizations that were not only, working on issues of sex work, but actually were representative. I think, SDI have also used a couple of innovative financing mechanisms to have that same kind of representativity around the grant-making process. And that's obviously a big step, and we're in this kind of mode and in this time, an era of reflecting of power and philanthropy. And I think this has been, a really interesting example to provide an opportunity for some other funders to think, okay, well, maybe, there's quite an extreme example of totally giving up control and letting grantee organizations really run with the support of a sector and a couple of issues. And that's, I think, is a really interesting signal and talking point for other funders, and even just for Catalyst to start thinking about if it wants to run a fund by and for social entrepreneurs, to look at other precedents and demonstrate why and how that is important and potentially powerful.
Yes, I think it's interesting because the Red Umbrella Fund is probably one of the most advanced examples of this, but we saw many of the organizations, the funding organizations that we studied, moving in this direction. So for example, Lankily had gotten to the point when we interviewed them of devolving their evolving their grant-making processes to the managers. So board no longer had to make funding decisions. It was now in the hands of managers. By the time, by now, in more recent days, they've actually devolved it to the grantee organizations themselves, devolved or evolved. So really, it's a process, and we've seen many of the organizations that we studied moving along this path, which is very exciting. The third practice is around propagating of systems work. And I think these are kind of the more flashy, splashy systems change grants that we often are starting to see now. But we really tried to look a little bit more deeper at what was happening here. What were the primary roles that funders could play here, not at an orchestration level, but rather at a connecting the dots level. So in the task of propagating systems work, funders can play this role of seeing kind of across the ecosystem, connecting organizations and resourcing them with large scale, long-term funding. These were the kind of features of that funding that we thought were really important. First of all, that it had quite a lot of substance behind it, but also that there was the acknowledgement that this wasn't a 2-year grant cycle, that wasn't appropriate for this type of funding, that rather it should be funded in 10-year, 20-year increments. And the organization that we looked at here was the Mcconnell Foundation, which has shown to be quite innovative in a number of their funding practices. But in particular, we thought that the reconciliation initiative that they have launched several years ago now was a really great example of that. Here in this case, they kind of set the theme of reconciliation, and then with a call for proposals, started to really connect a group of organizations together that were working on aspects of reconciliation, but seeing this as a 10-year, 20-year effort, and really ensuring that these funds were able to be delivered to organizations and create the connective tissue for reconciliation across Canada. Francois, is there anything you want to add about Mcconnell or about this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess their vision was also to build, what they call their reconciliation economy, right? That actually this wasn't only about the ability to create conversations, but actually take forward redress in a way that actually created an interaction between the parties, but recognizing to do that, this wasn't a set of one-offs, that actually they needed to build capacity within a system of actors to do this over the longer term. And so, I think there were some really interesting things, again, around this conversation of kind of how philanthropy needs to evolve and what, we're seeing as these kind of more radical or more pioneering examples of being able to do. Maybe just a word on co-impact. I think, they've been actually really interesting if you read through their guides around the kind of the principles and philosophies around what they do. I think one of the points, obviously, on propagating is, and I think this has been discussed in other forums as well, of like how do they use the leverage and the network and the resources they have over and above the funding, but also doing that in a way across a number of actors around a big issue. So they've just launched a large gender fund now, which I think is really interesting. And thinking about, well, what are they? Is it women leaders? Is it gender as an issue? And how do they really move forward? Something that is a long, a really deep and challenging issue to really move the needle on. So I think what I've appreciated about them, and while I think we talk about the big bets and our concern that big bets may or may not be really the answer to systems change, because sometimes they could perpetuate, and we've seen certainly, who receives these funds is part of that whole dynamic in development. But what I really appreciated about Co-Impact is, the transparency they've had in at least publishing their philosophies, how they go about doing what they do and what they're learning in the process. So I think it's helpful, and some of their guides were actually quite interesting. If any of you do engage with your own funders around these kinds of conversations, to look at some of that as food for thought as you engage in some of that.
We're going to head into our independent work now, and I am super conscious that there is so much wonderful wealth of knowledge in this group. And I'm sorry that we don't have more time to really surface that. I just want to say that that's something that we acknowledge that in this short amount of time, we haven't been able to do as much as we wanted to. One of the things that we wanted to be able to provide you an opportunity with here today is to think about these practices, not just as things that are out there in the world, but as things that could be brought home in the conversations that you have with the supporting actors in your sphere. So the conversation that we'd like you to be able to have in your peer groups is around a courageous conversation that you might decide to have with either an organization that is funding you or an organization that is supporting you in some way in aspects of measurement. So I want you to think about who is a supporting actor that you find is open and willing to have these conversations, or that might be if you initiate. And think about one practice that you've seen here today that might assist your organization in furthering its systems work. And consider how you might be able to have that conversation. So we're going to spend 5 minutes just in quiet reflection here. And then Julia's going to put us into our peer groups. We'll do 18 minutes again, because that's our magic number. So why don't we go ahead and have this quiet time for, let's say, 5 minutes until 10 past, and then we'll do small groups for 18 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll close out together. Thanks, Julia. Okay, Julia, I think let's go ahead and put them into groups. And we'll see you when you come back.
Thank you. Julia, can you make me co-host as well? Then I can jump in and out of groups, otherwise I can't do it. Please.
That went fast.
That, I don't know where the time went.
That's what happens
It
when
just-
you do Q&A.
Oh, Debbie, you
No.
have to make him co-host. I can't do it.
Okay.
That was my fault. I let people, there were so many nice comments that I just kept going.
I
Sorry.
know. I was like, stop.
I'm sorry, Cynthia. I kind of started it, but I was like, I was just going to talk the whole time, and it felt like there is richness.
No, I
in it.
know.
It's a small enough group, so
It says only
we're just not going to have reflection time. That's the only issue. So the question is whether we actually go into the groups and
Okay, I'm trying to find you. Sorry.
all that. Okay, well, it's not urgent because I think.
No,
Why don't we not? I found that I was more disruptive this last time because they were having quite good conversations.
So rather give them less time and then bring them back
Yeah, I
and
think
not
so.
interrupt.
Yeah.
Yeah, the sad thing with you guys is if you guys go in, people wait for you to talk.
Mm.
If it's we find that as a challenge for us as well. They're like, oh, what do you think? And it's like, but no, I'm just observing. I'm catalyst.
It's actually, that's one of the things I find much easier in a live room because you can kind of stand very quietly to the side.
Yes, and listen.
But in a Zoom breakout, there's no quiet standing to the side. You just
exactly.
zoom in.
Is that your alarm? I do that all the time.
Oh, I don't know what that is. Somebody from the UK.
Is that your phone? Oh, we lost Debbie. She went to a group. Yeah, she went to go join a group. I don't know if that was intentional. So we got 4 in one group and then 2 in another, but I guess that's okay.
Yeah, because you, Cynthia, and
Yeah.
Debbie and I are also in it. It messes
Yeah,
with the
okay, so
distribution.
asks us to join. There was more of a turnout this time, or is it just, I don't remember, was last week's smaller?
We think it was a problem with the calendar invitation.
But we recorded it, so
People will still get the knowledge.
did we talk too much, Cynthia? I always worry we talk too much, but I guess you got to get the content over.
Well, no, it was just a good, I think last week, the balance was perfect. And I think it was a slightly smaller group and we just kind of went through and I feel like I set a bad precedent.
Well, no, we're also more on top of the content of those practices than this part of the book. So it's also for us to kind of remind ourselves what's like the key thing. I found I was like rambling a little bit, so need to nail down.
And trying to distinguish between them because I felt like I was sometimes saying the same thing over and over again. Yeah, this is the stuff we haven't done before.
It was really interesting. So I mean, we'll chat about, you know, Kenneth. He's getting teenagers to read this stuff, and it's like pretty dense. You know, for high school students, it's like not even university level, right? And he's making them read this all, and then actually apply their like a systems work lens to their projects. I mean, they've actually done a pretty good job.
I know, I love it. I absolutely love it.
But I mean, I asked them at the end, I said, like, let's down for 5 minutes. Tell me really what you thought, you know? And, you know, I think some of them said like it is pretty dense, but they obviously enjoyed the storytelling. They could relate to that piece. Some of them were like, I had to look up, like I had to use a dictionary for every page, just some of the language. It wasn't always their first language. So
yeah.
That was interesting. But I mean, obviously they're going to be polite directly talking to me, but
Well, I got really good and honest feedback from my father. He says that he can get through about 3 to 4 pages at a time, and then he has to put it down. My dad will be honest with me.
Well, you saw that from Stuart Cohen, which was super interesting.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it when people give specific.
Welcome back, everyone. I think we just have a couple of minutes, so we'll dive in. We hope that you've had some interesting discussions around, how can you take a courageous conversation forward with some of your supporting actors, and whether that was valuable. We need 3 more lessons. Thank you, Kenneth. We feel that as well, in 3 more minutes, not 3 more lessons. So let's try. We thought we would try and wrap up rather than just about the specific discussion you've had just over the 3 weeks. I know not all of you have been to all of it, but we know it is just scratching the surface. But we'd love to hear 1 or 2 thoughts around, what was a kind of takeaway for you, or a moving, shift in something that you thought about. Feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand. We'd love to hear that as part of this. So we were just discussing with Julia around doing some kind of evaluation. I know that surveys generally are poorly filled out, but if it would be valuable, I think, both to Catalyst and to us to think about, how this served its purpose. So, Colin, you wanted to jump in? And
yeah, I'll try and do it in 15 seconds. I think the 3 sessions, and I've been at 2 of them, hands up, but really powerful and simple ideas. But the simplicity drives the power, and it's not the power for us. When I've shared these ideas and these structures with my team, people pick up on it really quickly. And that's the most, from an organizational point of view, it doesn't really matter what I think. It's actually if you can share these. So, really appreciative of your, it takes a lot of work to make them simple and intuitive, and you can communicate them so easily. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Colin. That means a lot. Elena.
No, I was just applauding what Colin said. Absolutely agree. This has been a pleasure, and everyone has been incredibly inspiring.
Thank you so much. I mean, we made a commitment to putting all the resources into the Google Drive folder, the videos, the slides. If anyone, still doesn't have access to the book, either through Kindle or otherwise, please let us know. PDF, we'll make sure we'll send a copy. We can get a copy to you digitally, and eventually the hard copies are coming out this week, so we're delighted about that as well. There's a request for the Google Drive link here. We also said in future, as Cynthia and I develop perhaps some more materials that are more geared towards learning, maybe for your organizations, we would come back and put that in the drive and remind everyone. Cynthia, anything else?
And Debbie wants to do a quick overview. One of the gifts you're going to give back for coming to this workshop that François and Cynthia provided to us is to share what you've learned with others. So if you can take the information you learned, share it with your communities, share it in your classes, those that are educators, share it with others. We've got the cases that are available and online. You've got the PowerPoints, you've got the notes. There's also teaching notes. So academics, reach out to me and I'll get you the teaching notes. But all that's available for you to pass on to others. Just don't share that PDF of the book that was kind of illegally shared.
Yes, exactly. Thanks for not getting me in legal trouble. But I mean, our aspiration is to make it as accessible as possible. That Amazon discount price will be there till the end of the year, so no, immediate rush. Do share that as well. Those links. We're sorry we can't do more with you now. I hope it's been an opportunity to delve into really affirming, hopefully, a lot of your work and giving you words, tools, and courage to continue the work that you do. We're just really grateful to have had the opportunity to sit in some of the discussions and learn from you. That's it from me. I think, Naida, you'd like to make a comment, and then Cynthia, maybe you can wrap up.
Yes, just super quick to just say thank you to both of you and for arranging this. And also, I just wanted to say that the book itself, when you go through all of it, when you read the cases, you're just like, right, okay, now it's so easy to talk about this. That's how I felt afterwards. I just felt like I had the equipment, the words, the tools, and not something that everyone would start to go, I don't understand. And so the book was really, really wonderfully done. So I just want to say thank you, because I know it was like probably a lot of work. So thank you. That was it.
Oh, thank you so much, Nida. Thank you. I think that's a great wrap up. And we just want to say thank you for being so engaged and for being here, for keeping your cameras on, for being present. We know it's a lot to do an hour and a half over 3 weeks. And just the presence and the engagement from everyone has been a real gift. We really appreciate it. Yes, we look forward to staying in touch with many of you, most of you, and go forth and do this systems work. Continue your wonderful work.
Thank you very much.
And let's turn on our audio and say goodbye. It's wonderful to hear everyone's voices as we leave the room.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Nice evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
I'll wait for the
all.
next course.
Thank you.
Thank you to Julia and Debbie.
Thank you.